Okay, I think we've got a good group. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning and good afternoon. This is The Art of RJ Lawyering, Movement, Policy, and Lawyering. And we are presenting on behalf of If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. We're really excited to have you all as part of this pre-conference. And we just want to give thanks to Spark and the Justice Now 2020 Conference Committee for allowing us to have the space to engage with all of you. So just to introduce ourselves, who you have presenting to you today from the staff of If, When, How. My name is Gerald Hayes. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Movement Building Director at If, When, How. I'm based just outside of Washington, D.C., and I'm really excited to be here with you all. And I will pass it to my colleague, Kimmy, to introduce herself, and then Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Gerald. I'm really happy to see you all here. My name's Cami Dodson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Professional Development Manager, If, When, How. I'm based about an hour north of the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, and looking forward to talking with you all today.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Melissa Torres Montoya, and I'm the Lawyer Engagement Manager here at If, When, How. And I use pronouns she, her as well. And I am based in Sacramento, California. And I'm really looking forward to jumping into chatting about reproductive justice lawyering and movement lawyering and all the great work that we can do coming up.
So we've got a little roadmap for what we want to accomplish today. So we're going to talk about what it means to be an RJ lawyer. We're going to start with our RJ squared presentation. We'll define what we mean when we talk about RJ lawyering. We'll do a little bit of values clarification. And then we'll have some time to talk through what lawyering in action looks like. So we're really excited to have you all here with us today. Before we sort of dive into our RJ squared presentations, we do want to, we had a chance to introduce ourselves, so we want to have a chance for you all to be able to introduce yourselves. So if you can put into the chat your name, your pronouns, your current location, and what you're hoping to get out of this workshop. If you put that into the chat so that we can all sort of see who is in the room in this space, we'd love to hear from you all to see, who's here. So go ahead, and if you could put that information into the chat, that would be great. So just to give you a, again, to dive a little deeper of what we're wanting to do, in this session, and the reason that we wanted to offer this, this pre-conference session, we know, given the current political environment, given what is happening in so many different levels of our communities, now is a real prime time to be thinking about what it means to use our legal privilege as lawyers, as law students, to advancing the issue of reproductive justice, and understanding that at the root of reproductive justice is also understanding racial justice. So we are going to start our session with RJ squared. We recognize some of you may, we have some of our fellows in the space. We have some law students and former chapter leaders. So this may feel a little familiar to you all, but we're going to dive into RJ squared, which is reproductive justice is racial justice. So let's start the RJ squared presentation. All right, so welcome to RJ squared. Again, racial justice is important and in fact very vital to the work of reproductive justice. And we need to understand this framework and vision to be able to actively practice RJ squared as reproductive justice advocates. I just want to give a really quick disclaimer. We try to use gender neutral language as much as possible, but occasionally I'll have to deviate and use some gender specific language specifically to relay statistics, but usually we have a practice of utilizing gender neutral language. And If When How is, committed to incorporating racial justice into our reproductive justice work. And this commitment extends to our attorney pro bono projects, our law and policy efforts, our coalition building with other organizations, as well as internally with our staff policies and practices at the national office. So we want to make explicit the connection between racial justice and reproductive justice because true reproductive justice cannot exist without racial justice. So RJ Squared is here to teach you how to analyze RJ issues with a racial justice lens. And we also want to acknowledge that this is an ongoing process and a lifelong practice. So it requires learning and unlearning many of the things, particularly things that we have learned as law students and as being part of the legal practice, that will take some active unlearning. And so we just want to, recognize at the outset that this is work. It's a muscle that you regularly have to flex, and that the process might feel uncomfortable at times, and that's part of the process, is to get comfortable with the discomfort, so to speak. So there's no perfect advocate, but what we can do together is to work to make RJ Squared a reality. So we'll give a little roadmap of this part of the RJ Squared presentation. So we'll define what our definition of reproductive justice is, what our definition of racial justice is, what it means to think of things through the RJ Squared lens. We'll talk a little about oppression and privilege, and then what's our role in the movement and how do we utilize this lens in our everyday work. So what is reproductive justice? So reproductive justice is a framework that was developed by women of color and specifically coined by Black women in 1994 in Chicago. And they utilized a human rights framework with this phrase coming from the combination of reproductive rights and social justice. So here are the things that when we think about reproductive justice, we think of it as an essential transformation of the systems and institutions that perpetuate oppression into structures that realize justice, and a future when all people can self-determine their reproductive lives free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. And reproductive justice has three major tenets, which is the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent the children you have in a safe and healthy environment. And so there have been some additional tenets that have come up, especially around freedom of sexual expression and identity, but these are the three core tenets that we utilize. We also want to talk about how the reproductive justice framework compares with some of the other frameworks that folks may be more familiar with. So, people often ask the difference between, if you say reproductive justice, how is that different than reproductive rights or reproductive health? So we actually consider these to be frameworks that work together, that they're not interchangeable, but that they have specific aspects that work together to advance towards reproductive freedom. So reproductive rights tends to be focused on the advocacy, policy, legislative, and litigation strategies. So this is the legal right to your reproductive autonomy. It tends to be, lawyers a lot fall into the reproductive rights aspect. This is where a lot of policy work happens. This is, a focus on the legal right to our reproductive autonomy. Reproductive health focuses on the actual provision of reproductive health care. So this includes providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, clinic staff, patients, really looking at the access to healthcare services that are related to people being able to access the healthcare that they need. And reproductive justice uses a human rights framework that addresses both systemic and individual oppressions. It tends to be focused at the grassroots level, is often led by people of color, and really looking at the structures of oppression, looking at, white supremacy and how it shows up, looking at, gender-based issues, looking at, how people's citizenship, all of those different identities, the ways that people's identities impact their ability to access their healthcare. So we foster at If When How a legal expertise for the reproductive justice movement. And you can put an RJ lens into practice in whatever career path you choose. And just a reminder that of these three, there's not a hierarchy to these relationships. They work together, but they are not interchangeable. And you might hear it talked about as three legs of a stool that you need because of the intense amount of work that is needed for us to reach reproductive autonomy. You need multiple pronged approaches to the work that we are doing. So let's talk about rights versus justice. There is a big difference between rights and justice, and a lot of it comes down to access. So a right could be a law, but if it isn't accessible, it's pointless. And so a question is, is the right to abortion enough? No, we need access. We need to be thinking of all of these all of the different pieces that are involved. We have to take, again, multi-pronged approach. So, in terms of some of the reproductive health and rights issues that are related to reproductive justice, we have a few here. So we've got contraception, sterilization, abortion, prenatal care, labor and delivery, postpartum care, sexually transmitted infection and disease prevention, testing and treatment, and sex education, particularly comprehensive sex education. But there are some additional reproductive justice issues that go beyond just family planning. So this is, some issues. This is not a complete list, but here are some additional aspects. So thinking about food deserts, affordable housing, quality education, livable wages, safety net programs, transportation, climate change, and freedom from state-based and domestic violence. So what makes, reproductive justice a little bit different than reproductive health and reproductive rights? Reproductive justice, takes a more holistic view of what people need to thrive. And, it can include broader, issues like HIV decriminalization, for example. It's why, things like police brutality shows up as a reproductive justice issue because of the ability to, want to raise your family in safe and healthy communities. So reproductive justice offers a larger umbrella for, for folks to engage in some of our issues. So now let's get to talk about racial justice. Again, If When How uses the phrase RJ squared because reproductive justice is racial justice is reproductive justice. And communities of color have a long history of barriers that precluded them from exercising real, meaningful choice about their reproductive health and lives. And if we ignore this reality, we will be completely ignoring the history and the principles of RJ. So we want to, really hone in on why racial justice is an important part of RJ. So what is racial justice? This is a definition that comes from Race Forward, and you can go to raceforward.org for additional information. But racial justice is the systematic, fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. And justice can include civil rights, but civil rights laws don't always involve justice. So voting rights is a great example. So even if you meet all of the requirements and are eligible to vote, there could still be multiple factors and potential barriers that affect your ability to cast a vote on election day. This can include what district you live in, what language you speak, or whether you have reliable transportation, childcare, if you have the ability to have that day off, or be away from your job, as well as accessing having accessible polling stations in your neighborhood. So again, thinking about the systems that can be in place that impact your access to justice. So racial justice can be many things, and among them include dismantling discriminatory systems and institutions, acknowledging disparities and inequities and then addressing them, valuing the autonomy of all people, supporting and centering the people most affected by injustice, ensuring access to the resources people need to thrive, advocating for safe workplaces, schools, and streets, creating equitable policies and practices, amplifying the voices and experiences of people of color, fighting implicit and explicit bias, and dismantling white supremacy. So, how do we analyze using an RJ lens? So this means taking a hard, critical look beyond facial words and meanings. It means questioning who is being affected, both directly and indirectly. It means evaluating intent versus impact. It means digging deeper to identify who is benefiting and who is being harmed. And it means bringing issues of race, class, religion, immigration status, and other identity factors into the conversation because every part of a person's identity can contribute to how folks are being affected. So let's look at some RJ issues with both a reproductive justice and a racial justice lens. So for us, RJ squared means fighting implicit and explicit bias. So in a recent study, 69% of Muslim women who wore hijab reported at least one incident of discrimination, as opposed to 29% of women who did not wear hijab. So how can we use an RJ lens here? Well, by using a critical RJ lens, we can see that this affects individuals, families, and entire groups of people's ability to thrive, because we all have the right to be safe in public and to create and sustain families in a safe and healthy environment. And in this particular instance, wearing a hijab is deeply rooted in race, religion, and religious expression. And so facing discrimination, just facing potential violence based on your religious expression is an RJ squared issue. RJ squared means supporting and centering the people who are most affected by injustice. So as an example, people of color are disproportionately affected by poverty, violence, HIV/AIDS, discrimination, and harmful policies like the Hyde Amendment. So many of you may be familiar with the Hyde Amendment, but the Hyde Amendment, which initially passed in 1976, so it's been around for quite some time, where federal funding was barred for use for abortion coverage. This meant that anyone receiving Medicaid health insurance, mostly low-income individuals and families who would become ineligible to have their health insurance cover their abortion health care, And we know that Rosie Jimenez was the first known person to die because Hyde denied her insurance coverage for her abortion. She was a 27-year-old single mother who was 6 months away from graduating and earning her teaching credential. And after she was denied coverage in Texas, she obtained an unsafe abortion in Mexico and later died from septic shock. So what's happening here? This is the limitation of, with limiting coverage for abortion care, we know doesn't actually put an end to abortion. It just makes safe abortions inaccessible. And Hyde is an RJ issue because it affects a person's ability to afford the reproductive health care that they need. And so this is an issue that we are specifically working on at If When How, particularly wanting to overturn the Harris v. McRae decision from 1980, which was a Supreme Court case that challenged the Hyde Amendment. And one of the aspects in the dissent, Justice Thurgood Marshall noted that the Hyde Amendment was designed to deprive poor and minority women of the constitutional right to choose abortion. So Hyde might look like neutral policy that's limiting government funding, but if we're viewing it through an analytical RJ lens, we can see that this is a law that actually targets certain group of people, namely low-income people who are hurt most by these types of policies. So we need to understand the intersections when we're thinking about how our identities impact our access to rights. So our identities are intersectional because our lives are multidimensional. So we're going to use all this information to start putting these pieces together. So you may have heard this terminology intersectional before. It's coined by the brilliant law professor and race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And it was created to explain the unique oppressions, biases, and violence that Black women face. And intersectionality is a lens to sort of see through, to see where power comes and where it collides, where it interlocks and intersects. In any given situation, it's not simply that there's a race problem, a gender problem, or a class problem. And if you use a single issue framework like that, it's harmful because it erases the impact of folks who are subject to all of these things. So intersectionality is a more holistic view, and practicing intersectionality in our justice work will ensure that we don't leave people behind. So let's talk now about how we are influenced by oppression. We've got a few definitions here for you. So oppression is the systemic devaluing of certain identities in contrast to the privileged norm. So certain groups are denied something of value while others have ready access, and there's a systematic lack of representation or misrepresentation, for example, in the media. We'll get to a specific example of that in just a moment. So we also think about privilege. Privilege is the unearned social power, and it's usually invisible to those who have it. It's a concept of having your identity be centered or treated as the standard. So a couple of examples here include race, so having white privilege, gender, having male and cisgender privilege, your status, your citizenship privilege, having access to power and information, so having education privilege, and economic, having financial privilege. So we interact with both oppression and privilege throughout our everyday routines, whether we're at work, at school, with family and friends, in restaurants, and even places like the grocery store. And with oppression and privilege comes implicit and explicit biases. So we're going to talk about what racial bias looks like in action. So here is an example of privilege and racial bias. There are two articles here. This is from news coverage from Hurricane Katrina. So we've got a picture of a person of color. Below is a photo of a white couple. And these images show identical depictions of the same action. However, the descriptor language is what really sets a different tone. So, the headlines read that, Black people are looting food, whereas white people are finding food. There's much more of having white victims being referred to as survivors or residents, while Black victims who are doing the exact same thing are called looters or criminals. And so we know that language really matters. It affects how we view, think about, and treat each other. And acknowledging these racial biases is important to understanding the institutional and cultural obstacles that people of color experience on a daily basis, and especially trying to navigate the criminal justice system. And these biases can often lead to mistrust and violence. And more importantly, media representation matters. So here, the media has assumed and already portrayed the person of color as doing a criminal act. So we have to ask, how do we access justice when these racial biases are at play? We can actually look at another example, which is racial bias in the criminal justice system. So here is another example. So on March 23rd, 2015, two sister sites, thegazette.com and kcrg.com, published stories about two groups of men who were arrested for burglary. One group was white, the other group was Black. And although the stories were written from the same newsroom about the same crime, the story that implicated the group of white men featured their official college wrestling team portraits as its header image, while the report involving a group of Black men featured their mugshots. And when questioned about this, the news outlet said, we were unable to obtain the mugshot images of the white suspect, which they later had to find, but it was over a week later before those mugshots were released. And regardless of the truth or falsity, think about the impact behind that action. Media portrayals play a huge role in how our criminal justice system works, and what people's perceptions are of a suspect's guilt or innocent, not to mention, the effect on potential jurors. So we have to ask ourselves, for whom does the media use mugshots? And for whom do they use nicer school or family photos to relay the same message? And why? This side-by-side comparison speaks volumes to ongoing conversations about race, policing, and racial bias in mainstream media crime coverage. And let's also ask ourselves, who is more likely to be criminalized for pregnancy outcomes? Why is there a discrepancy in Black women's maternal mortality rate in comparison to white women? Who is more likely to be believed especially when there are complicated pregnancies or when they're in labor? These are examples of institutional and cultural oppressions, and we must actively fight against biases like these that are both implicit and explicit. So let's address privilege. And I think this is particularly important when we think about, being lawyers, being part of the, legal system. What is our legal privilege? So our identities are intersectional, again, because our lives are multidimensional. And we can experience both oppression and privilege, and it informs our individual roles in the movement. So reproductive justice and racial justice focuses on highlighting the voices and experiences of those with the least amount of privilege. This means that the movement will be most effective when it is led by the folks who are most affected by injustice. So let's unpack our privilege a little bit. So no matter how complex our identities are, as undergrad students, law students, and lawyers, we have a specialized skill set and multiple levels of privilege. So everyone has privilege here, and privilege is much more than wealth or the lack thereof. So we've got a couple of questions here for you to consider. And consider how answering no to any of these questions may indicate a privilege that you haven't considered before. So a few questions to think about. Do people often misgender you? Have you ever experienced homelessness? Is public transit your only option for transportation? Did you learn English as a second language? Do you fear for your safety when interacting with police? Do you live paycheck to paycheck? Do the results of your background check disqualify you from getting a job? Privilege shows up in many ways and isn't always as obvious as race, gender, or class privilege. And so we are vital to the movement, and we have to address how issues of privilege are showing up for us and how do we leverage it. So no matter how complex our identities may be, we have a specialized skill set and again, multiple levels of privilege. So here's how we can show up. To show up for reproductive justice, we need to center the most marginalized and lift up impacted communities, identify the systems of oppression and discrimination, actively fight against explicit and implicit biases, work within your community, educate your peers and call for systemic change, and acknowledge the work of people of color. And everyone can use the RJ lens to work on RJ issues. And folks can play an important role in the advancement of reproductive justice. In particular, white folks can play an important role because everyone can experience reproductive injustice, but we should keep in mind that these things we need to center our work around the folks that are most impacted. And a lot of times that means people of color, that means our LGBTQ community, that means folks who experience immigration bias, young people. We need to make sure that those folks are at the center of our organizing and reproductive and racial justice work. And so our sort of last thing around unpacking our privilege is thinking about this equation. Racism is equal to prejudice plus power. It's why, when we say power, we mean systemic power. That's cultural, political, and interpersonal power, specifically power that generally white people hold, that other identities don't have the same access to these systems of power. And when we say prejudice, we acknowledge that anyone of any race can exercise and experience prejudice. However, white folks, can experience prejudice, but cannot experience racism because they possess the dominant power in this equation. That's why there's no such thing as reverse racism, because it's important to understand that prejudice without that systemic organizational power is just prejudice. And so I want to also address that these statements don't undermine the hardships that white people can experience, especially related to reproductive oppression. The point here is more to recognize that for white people, race has not necessarily been a factor in those oppressions. So just wanting to be really clear on that. So what can we do? We talk about listening up or speaking up to keep it pretty simple. So here's some questions to ask yourself on whether to listen up. Can I use my platform to include others? Am I speaking for someone who can speak for themselves? Am I the best person to speak on this topic? Is there another perspective that I can include? And questions to ask yourself on whether to speak up. Is my identity or experience being represented? Do I have a unique perspective to add? Even though I may feel out of place or uncomfortable, is there something missing from the conversation I can bring? So we really want to encourage you to, step into your power, to, take up space when it needs to, but, step back. If your identity is already being, or your viewpoint is already being well represented, use your platform to empower and uplift the voices and experiences of others. And if you are in a space where you do have a lot of privilege that's showing up, make sure you're not dominating the conversation. And again, making space and bringing in those perspectives and viewpoints of others. And I think this is particularly important when we think of ourselves as advocates, as lawyers, and thinking about, for those who work with clients or who are representing particular constituencies, that part of our power and our privilege to be folks that get listened to, the ability to get into rooms and spaces where decisions are being made, is to make sure that we are bringing these perspectives in, that we are listening to the communities that we are serving, and that we are able to bring uplift those voices. And this is an ongoing challenge, but you have to continue to challenge yourself to be a great activist. And again, this is a muscle that we have to use and flex. And so the last piece here is around being a co-conspirator for racial justice. So being more than an ally, be a co-conspirator. Allyship is generally passive. It's saying, I'm here to support you, I'm here for you, but from a distance. And it's, more alignment and acknowledgement oriented, whereas co-conspirators are active partners. I support you, I'm here with you, I'm putting my body on the line. It's being action oriented. And the reason that we, want to encourage folks to be co-conspirators as opposed to just a passive allyship is because passive support will never dismantle racist structures, policies, and practices. And so the more privilege that you had, and recognizing that privilege is not necessarily a bad thing, and that, for many of us, we actually have more privilege than we realize, even if it's not overt and obvious. And the more privilege that we have, that means the more power and space that we have to leverage and to create change. So, as sort of a conclusion here, RJ Squared is really thinking about how we can continue to analyze using a reproductive justice lens. We must actively question who is being directly and indirectly affected, evaluating intent versus impact, digging deeper to identify who benefits and who is harmed, bringing intersectional identity factors into the conversation, and practicing when to speak up and when to listen up. And remembering that justice is multidimensional and that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And the best thing about using an RJ lens is that you can put it to practice in your personal, educational, and professional lives in whatever career path that you choose. And especially in being part of the legal system, we have a lot of privilege that we can and power that we can leverage, and utilizing this RJ Squared analysis helps us to get closer to our goals of achieving reproductive justice. So that was RJ Squared. We've got some time now for questions that folks have, and just wanting to make some space for discussion to see if there were things that were raised that folks that might have been new for someone, to understanding. We want to hear from you about, are there aspects of the RJ Squared that you're already using in your in your professional life or in your personal life? Or are there aspects of this that you can already see being able to apply? So we'll open it up for folks to sort of hop in if you are interested in sort of sharing your perspective. And then we have a break coming up after this. So,
And you can also pop in your questions in the chat box or verbalize them, whatever is the easiest approach for you.
is there any new information that folks learned from this, or is this all things that people have already been utilizing in your day-to-day?
Great, thank you for that feedback, Jalissa.
And if folks want to also pop into the chat, if you can name one or two things that you want to bring into into your work. And yes, we will make the presentation available, the slides available.
During the break, I'll actually pop in a link to the slides as well as some readings if folks want to learn more.
Yes, and Cami, that's a great note. There are so many really fantastic resources. This is not the sort of RJ squared concept is something that we've sort of coined at If When How, but it's not we're not the only ones who are thinking about these issues in this way. And so we, definitely encourage reading more about the work of some fantastic reproductive justice scholars. In particular, Toni Bond and Loretta Ross are two of those 12 women who, coined the term reproductive justice, who are still very active, and both have lots of readings and books that are available. And there's lots of fantastic, grassroots RJ organizations that are personifying this concept and how they are organizing, how they are engaging with their communities, really making sure that at the root of how they're thinking about their work, they're understanding this dynamic of, we can't just talk about reproductive oppression if we're not addressing some of the racism that is happening, and being clear that it's not just race issues, it's specifically racism. This really comes up in the context of maternal mortality, where we know that the rates for Black women experiencing maternal mortality are much higher than other races, and it's not because that there's something inherent to their racial identity that that they're experiencing higher rates. It is actually like the racism that is happening within the larger medical system. It's that Black women who are college educated and are of means are still experiencing higher rates than other identities who are less educated and have less means. And it's more about like, what is the system? What are these health inequities that are at play that are creating barriers to people being able to access the healthcare that they need? And again, it's not specific. It's not just about access. It's also about like let's look at the systems. Let's not just focus on the individual and somebody's individual right, but let's look at what are the systemic oppressions that are happening, and how do we address the systemic aspects.
And someone noted in the chat also there's a few notes, Gerald, about different aspects that individuals were interested in. And one that caught my attention was about the Hyde Amendment being new information. And I just wanted to uplift some of the work that another partner organization is doing called All Above All. And that, I think Gerald went over this, but the Hyde Amendment, there have been states throughout the last 25, 30 years that have funded it on a state level. And so there are movements around, like, either just in your community, even if your state doesn't fund abortion, to pass a resolution in your city saying that public funds should be used towards abortion, that it should be included in health coverage and not carved out as is a health, it is a health service. And most recently, as like 2 or 3 years ago, Illinois passed legislation to make funding available. So there are movements around that, and that's definitely an opportunity to jump in on in an advocacy way.
All right, so we now have a break. So we have a 15-minute break. Please return at the top of the hour.
Great. Should we jump back in? Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Gerald, for that wonderful presentation. I just love RJ Squared. I can listen to it over and over again, and I think that there's always something new to pick up on and a new kind of thought process sparks in my mind. And this time I was thinking about all the varieties of ways we experience reproductive justice geographically, just like the different experiences lately, talking to individuals around the country during this election. And so thank you. It was really helpful to, I think, level set before we jump into reproductive justice in or lawyering in the context and with an applied lens of reproductive justice. And so I'm going to start off, though, a little bit more broadly, because when we talk about social justice movements and social change, a component of social change and most justice movements are changing laws. They're much more, but an aspect of it is often changing laws. And so it makes sense that lawyers get involved in social justice movements, especially in that component of trying to change laws to affect change. And this has led to, because I think lawyers like to often think of things in theories and legal theories. And so that legal theories are important because they can impact the way that the pathway in which we try to affect change. I think the reality also is that life is more complicated and more intersectional than a change. So theories have to be put into action. And so the likelihood is that these different types of theories are applied in different ways and at different moments and different what's happening in the world may necessitate different avenues for change. But I'm going to set forth a couple of these different theories because I think in the reproductive justice movement, we utilize, and in the reproductive justice movement, when we're lawyering for reproductive justice, we utilize different types of legal theories for change. So the first one is access to justice. So this one is increasing access to the judicial system in itself can improve outcomes for marginalized individuals. Another one is law reform. So legal victories, so court cases, we can definitely see that leads to social change. And that kind of brings up, I think, specifically what Cheryl was talking around the difference between rights and access, right? One theory of change is law reform. So making that change to the law, and reproductive justice is often saying, yes, that's important. We need that change, but we also need to take steps to make sure that each individual has access to that reproductive right or to that change that we've made through the law. So what does it mean to just make a change in the law? It means that we want to actually translate that into real access and make sure that all individuals can actually make, in this case, decisions about their reproductive health lives. And the final one that I'm sharing today is democratizing law. So democratizing legal tools and knowledge will lead to social change. So essentially making sure that more people have access to, not just access, we talked about access to justice, but have that knowledge and are a part of the legal system, right? So I think that there are lots of different examples of this, but certainly making sure that there are more individuals who have like paralegals, that there are more individuals with that it's in community lawyering, and so that laws are not necessarily, I think oftentimes they feel very siloed and it feels like there's just the specific group of individuals who understand how to navigate the law, but making sure that more individuals can navigate the law for themselves is an aspect of democratizing law. So these are a couple of different examples. Sorry. So these are a couple of different examples of what the legal theories are. Now, specifically, what is reproductive justice lawyering? So reproductive justice lawyering is, one, I want to make a note that it's not set in stone, right? This is organic and dynamic, and it's responsive to individuals' needs. And we have to think of reproductive justice lawyering as, in many ways, it's outside of that traditional legal theories, it's outside of traditional legal tactics, because we want to be able to be nimble and creative and responsive, and understanding totally what Gerald was saying, that we don't live single issued lives. We're not just narrowly focused on one aspect. Reproductive health and reproductive or sexual health decision making, our sexual lives, they're complex, they're complicated, they're connected to so many different structures in society. And so we want to make sure to understand all those different connections and advocate and change the law so that it is according to our lived experiences. And so this is one, that's all to say that this is one example of how we are lawyering for reproductive justice. And it may be very different according to different individuals as a lawyer, as your lived experience. And so in reproductive justice lawyering, we recognize that the ability to make self-determined decisions at every stage of a person's reproductive life, including meaningful access to abortion, contraception, and pregnancy care, remain out of reach for many. And also, it's not just about those kind of aspects. Those are, I think, the original sort of what we specifically initially identify around reproduction, right? But it's all of the different aspects of society that we've talked about earlier. And those are out of reach for many. So we're starting off from this place already that even if a right exists technically according to like the Supreme Court, the reality is many people can't actually exercise that right. And so we start off from a place recognizing that individuals' decision making is already pretty restrained according to all the different systemic and societal barriers that exist right now. So communities of color and people with low incomes are disproportionately harmed by these barriers, burdens, and stigma that make accessing care and resources more difficult, and accessing information as well. And in some cases, it's impossible to actually exercise decision-making around our reproductive health. So lawyering for reproductive justice means taking a holistic, people-centered approach to dismantling oppressive institutions and redistributing and sharing wealth and power so that people can self-determine their reproductive lives free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. So this is essentially at its core what we're aiming to do. And how we actually go about lawyering for reproductive justice, like I said, because it is holistic, because we recognize all these different ways and barriers that impact someone's ability to self-determine their reproductive lives, it means that we are lawyering for reproductive justice in so many different ways. And I think it's important to note that, you know, yes, the three of us sitting here are lawyers, but lawyering for reproductive justice isn't just necessarily limited to those that are traditional lawyers. It means that we're impacting and changing laws according to our lived experiences. So anyone who is attempting to change those laws, to inform those laws, is doing an aspect of lawyering for reproductive justice. So I'm going to share a couple of examples of what that means. So here are a few examples, and we're going to our next, after our next interactive activity, we're going to jump into more of examples of like what it means to be lawyering in action according to the fellowship that we have, according to the network that we're building up of lawyers. But I'm just going to share a couple right now. So reproductive justice lawyers respond and support the unique needs of their communities, and they bring an intersectional lens to their work, and they leverage their skills and privilege. That was definitely something Gerald was talking about, was, you know, being able to leverage and utilize that privilege to make effective change, to expand reproductive freedom for everyone. So examples of this are getting educated on the histories of reproductive justice and racial justice. So great news. You all are already starting with that right now by taking part in this presentation and sharing that knowledge with your colleagues. So I think that Gerald was talking about, we experience it. We have moments of opportunity to talk about it in the grocery store, in Ubers, when we're all able to get back into the world, which will be sooner than later, fortunately. We will be able to have those conversations. I am such a fan of chatting about reproductive justice with friends who aren't necessarily in this sphere, because while they may not be in this sphere, we all have reproductive lives, we all have sexual lives, and so these are matters that are important to all of us. And I think that they are topics of great importance, and so they're of interest for a lot of individuals to talk about. And there are a lot of different inroads and ways to have those conversations where we can start off at a point of agreement. I think reproductive justice is particularly a great lens, because we recognize all these different ways that impact our reproductive health lives. So maybe someone isn't as comfortable talking about sexual health in the way that we do in reproductive justice, but they might want to talk about pregnancy protection at their place of employment, what it was like to be a pregnant person in their workplace, or they might want to talk about a living wage. And all of these are issues that we can eventually sort of work our way into talking about reproductive justice. So educating ourselves and then sharing our knowledge with others and learning how to do so in a place that we meet individuals where they are. Fundraising to support community organizations, such as funds to provide menstrual products to incarcerated people, bail funds, or mutual aid groups. And here's some more directly, I think, traditional legal lawyerly ways that we think of is representing a young person who is navigating the legal maze of forced parental involvement laws in order to access abortion care. So unfortunately, there are a lot of states, first of all, the vast majority of states in the US that do require either parental consent or parental notification. And so which is meant to limit young people's access to abortion. So a young person needs to go into a court setting if they don't, whatever their circumstances are, that they don't want to have their parents, they can't get their parents' permission, or they don't want to notify their parents. And so that means going in front of a judge and sharing their story. And so making sure that there are lawyers to represent them and represent them in a way that is supportive of a young person. Providing legal services is another one, such as reviewing contracts or leases pro bono to local grassroots groups centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So there are a lot of, I think this is the right crowd to talk about. There are a lot of reproductive justice grassroots organizations on the ground all across the country. And so being able to provide legal services to those organizations pro bono is definitely a way to further the reproductive justice movement. Another one is representing people criminalized for self-managing their abortions. And moving more into the sphere, I know I saw some people are here to learn more about policy. So that's clearly a huge component of reproductive justice. Lawyering is changing the laws or introducing new laws from the legislative stage. So not just later on when we're litigating, but to advocate for just and advocating for just and inclusive policies at law schools. So it's not just about the legislative session, but it's in our workplaces, in our schools, and our children's schools, and such as paid parental leave, racial equity, accountability practices, and making campuses safer without police. Finally, every person can get involved in a different way. You can start a campaign, you can introduce a piece of legislation, go talk to your local legislative representative, but we all lead busy lives. So also making sure that maybe there's something that you see that's really important. So lending your support to that. Someone else may have introduced a piece of legislation that you find really important. Testifying in support of it, or signing a petition, or calling your member of Congress or your local legislative representative to support proactive legislation to improve access to reproductive health care is also really critical when that's a little bit of a lighter lift. So those are some ways that you can engage in reproductive justice lawyering, and a little bit around, taking the reproductive justice lens and applying it to lawyering. And I think now we will be doing a values clarification exercise, and I'm happy to jump in a little bit more later on about other ways that we have lawyers getting involved in reproductive justice.
All right, so this is Gerald again. So when we think about RJ lawyering, one of the things that we strongly believe is that our work should be rooted in values, that we should be coming from a values-driven and a values-led perspective. And so one of the things that can happen is, we all come from different backgrounds. We have different value systems. We have different ways that we have been brought up, different components to what makes up our sort of value system. And it's not always, they're not always coming from the same place. Sometimes we don't always have information to be able to fully think through a situation, and sometimes need to do a better job of thinking through different perspectives, thinking through different, what are some of the different lived experiences that might influence how we think about a particular issue. And especially when it comes to reproductive justice issues, where lived experiences are often not as valued, there's not enough emphasis that's placed. Sometimes things can be, theoretical. This comes a lot in policy when we think about how legislation gets made, where there are laws that are created that aren't actually taking into account people's lived experiences and people's what actually is happening, what people have to go through as a result of a particular piece of legislation. Where if we think more from a values perspective, and if we again are trying to center the folks who are most impacted, this can help us as we work in coalitions with each other, as we work in different spaces, especially as we think about if we're representing specific clients or we're representing particular populations. Coming from a values base is going to help us to better think about the folks that we're representing, better think about the folks that we are sort of connecting with. So we've got a values clarification exercise. And here are some of the goals for what we want to do. So this is going to be a much more interactive part of our session, and this is where we need you all to rumble with us on this. And so the goals for the values clarification exercise is to develop awareness and alignment of RJ values, to identify your values, assumptions, and biases, and potentially reconsider your position in light of what you hear from other participants. This is a way of hearing about people's lived experiences and what they're bringing into the room and into the space with them. And so the way that this is going to work, typically we do this in person, and we will set up the room with four corners with each of these statements, whether it's strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. Now, if you pay attention, you'll notice here there's not a neutral option. There is not a, well, I could see it both ways kind of option. And we know that we are working with law students and lawyers who are used to being able to argue both sides of an issue. We are really good at being devil's advocates and being able to see multiple perspectives, which is a great skill to have, but not one that we want to use here. We actually want you to take a stand in a position, and we want to sort of lay some groundworks. This is we want to make sure that people feel comfortable in this space. So know that how you might identify in this space doesn't mean that if you initially are strongly agree or strongly disagree, that somebody else's perspective might actually persuade you to think differently. And it doesn't mean that you are wrong. There are no right or wrong answers in the exercise that we are about to do. But the ability to kind of think about something from a different perspective, or to hear new information or different information from what you might what you might have perceived, and then saying, oh, you know what, I think differently about that now, or that's a different perspective I hadn't considered. I still might feel strongly from my initial viewpoint, but now I can see a different perspective and I have a better understanding of where other people are coming from. So this is an exercise that, I wish that was done in law school. I wish that, it's particularly like in coalition spaces. I think if more of this type of exercise was done, we could have a better understanding of where people are coming from, where they're, having different perspectives informs how people view certain issues. And so understanding those perspectives help us to come to agreements in different ways, come to agreements that are bringing in multiple viewpoints and are not based on sort of narrow thinking. So the questions that we're gonna ask you are sort of based primarily in some of our strategic initiatives that If, When, How is focused on. So these will be some questions that are specifically related to reproductive justice issues. So how this is going to work, and again, typically we are in person when we're doing this, and you can physically see where people are. Since we are doing this virtually, we're going to utilize the chat function as a way to visually represent where people are, and it's going to mean you're going to have to pick something. So you'll be using the chat to sort of identify where you are in a particular statement. And so what will happen is I will read a statement, and it'll give you a minute to think about it. And then you'll put into the chat one of these four statements: either strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And I want to reiterate, there is no right answer. There is no wrong answer to this. Whatever your belief system is, wherever you are showing up in the space, that's where you are. There's not an anticipated like, oh, you said this. Oh, I guess you're not really RJ, or you don't really have a values perspective. That's not at all what this exercise is. It's really just to identify a starting point. And then we'll open it up, and I will just sort of ask for volunteers from each of those. If there are people who say strongly agree, I'll ask folks in the strongly agree. Tell us about what that why you're in that way. What are some of the factors that led that are why you are in this camp? And we'll go through each. We'll see if there are folks in each of those. And then after, we'll see if there's anyone who's like, I have a different, hearing that perspective has actually, I'm feeling differently about my initial statement. And I think I'm now actually, I'm no longer strongly agree, I'm more in the agree, or I'm no longer strongly disagree, I'm more in the disagree, that sort of thing. Okay, so again, don't lawyer this. Don't feel like you have to justify in any way. And again, we're not expecting, there's not a neutral option here intentionally. We need you to sort of just pick one and sort of go with that. And again, it's okay to share, if you are moved by something. Okay, so here is the first question, and I will also put this into the chat box too. So especially for those who need to, who are more visual and want to see it. So the first question, or the first statement to think about is: people know what is best for their own bodies. people know what is best for their own bodies? I'll put that in the chat. Oh, wow, there's a lot of strongly agrees. And it's okay if you have a different, don't feel like just because other people are in one camp, if you are differently, that actually leads to some really good discussion when we have folks who have different viewpoints. All right, has everyone had an opportunity to share into their space? And our facilitators, y'all can participate as well. Okay, so I'm going to ask for some volunteers. And just as a courtesy to our ASL interpreters, if you can state your name as you start talking, that will help make sure that that they are able to translate that well. So do I have any volunteers who wants to start our discussion of people know what is best for their own bodies and talk about what's sort of coming up for you and why you are in the place that you are. So we'll start with the strongly agree. Any volunteers? Just go ahead and start.
I can go. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Kelsey Jackson, and I was in the strongly agree camp just because I feel like your own body is something that you should have control over, and your body is obviously yours, and you know like what is best for it. I did think of something though while we were like waiting for this though, is that I live in an area with like a lot of people who think COVID isn't real and a lot of people not wearing masks, and so I was kind of thinking like, okay, like in most situations, I'm like, yeah, you know exactly what's best for your body. But then like people not wearing masks and not like vaccinating their children, I'm kind of like, oh, I don't know. So I don't know, I guess that's the lawyer in me or law student trying to be like neutral. But I think in most cases, I would just strongly agree.
Excellent, thank you. Others who want to add their perspective into the space? Or even respond to Kelsey's, observation about our current pandemic, because that definitely, I know for me, has raised some questions about, people's decision making and whether or not folks trust science or that sort of thing. Others who wanted to add their voice.
Well, I can jump in. I wasn't on the strongly agree, mostly just because of what Kelsey kind of pointed out at the end. I think that if we have all of the different aspects in place, so for me, I just think about like my family and community growing up was Mexican American, and I think that I saw lots of instances where it really frustrated me that like sex ed didn't provide as much detail or as much information. So I think people, when given information, when we all have the same access to information, do know I agree that we know our bodies, but sometimes I'm really concerned that we're not all given the same amount of information to interpret what's happening with our bodies and to make decisions based on a full range of options. So that's why I put agree, but I guess it depends on, and not to be lawyering, but like, what is the scenario and what is the society in which we're talking about? But for the most part, I would say strongly agree, like if all that information is present, because I think that's, I guess what Kelsey was saying is, do they believe in science? Do we know, like, are we all given the same base level of information?
Great, this is Gerald again. So here are a couple of things that can come up for folks for this particular question. So just some things to think on, and some of this has already been sort of identified. So here's some points of tension around access to information and particularly whether people have reproductive health information. And then supremacy of medical opinion is something that sometimes comes up, and particularly depending on who's in the audience for when we are doing this exercise. So especially when we have more clinicians and abortion providers in this space. What is best from a medical standpoint versus autonomy. So what is best for an individual's circumstances. So I am the daughter and sister of doctors. And so in our family, science is very important. But there's also a respect for, what patient needs are. And remembering that, efficacy rates, for example, for contraception, efficacy rates might be important for providers in terms of, their perspective of like, this is what's most effective at preventing pregnancy. But if you're not thinking about, what the needs are for an individual patient, what their actual goals are. You might have a method of contraception that is 99.9% effective, but if it's something where someone doesn't want to have something in their body that they can't remove, that's going to be a 0% effective for that person. And so, again, thinking about like how we value medical opinion in terms of who gets to decide what is best, and how much autonomy do we give people around their own, but also like how much access to information do people have to be able to make informed decision. And if you are dealing with circumstances where for example, in the case of sex education, where the state is not affirmatively providing comprehensive sex education, then in those circumstances, people may not have the full information that they need to make decisions for their own bodies. And so then, which sort of leads into my next question. So before I get there, are there any additional points of view, or has anyone been sort of moved or shifted their positioning based on the conversation? Melissa?
Gerald, this is Melissa. Yes. I was actually just noting that I thought there were some really interesting comments in the chat box. So I know for myself, sometimes when I'm really absorbed into a presentation, I don't always see everything that's happening in the chat. So I just, if you don't mind, I wanted to read some of them out loud to bring them into the conversation. So Diana Parker mentioned, yes, in theory, absolutely. I think talking about strongly agree. In practice, communities are strategically cut off from from education about bodies. And then Madeline Morcell said, it's so frustrating the way in which race and gender-based healthcare discrimination manifests, an example, the maternity mortality epidemic. And then Nick Beard joined in and said, I have much stronger feelings about this after giving birth. I think about Serena Williams was ignored and how the pregnant person's insight is not always respected. And then Diana Parker also wrote, Black people are expected and conditioned to expect to deal with this higher level of pain. So just bringing in that it definitely sparked some conversation. This is Melissa, and I'll hand it back to Gerald.
Thank you. Okay, so this is Gerald again. So the next question, I think, and that I think that earlier question sort of leads nicely into is the state has a role to play in how people receive reproductive health care. The state, so meaning government and other entities, has a role to play in how people receive reproductive health care. So please put into the chat whether you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Again, the prompt is, the state has a role to play in how people receive health care. And for those who just joined the the question is, the state has a role to play in how people receive reproductive health care. Put into the chat whether you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with the statement. The state has a role to play in how people receive reproductive health care. All right. This, I think, may be one of the first times that I've done the values fair clarification where people have been pretty aligned in the same place. This is really, really interesting and fascinating to see. All right, so does anyone want to share to start with their perspective of why, of their thoughts about the statement, the state has a role to play in how people receive reproductive health care? And please remember to state your name as you are sharing your response. And you can also type in if you don't want it to speak it out loud. What are some of the things that are coming up for folks on this one?
I can go if no one else wants to. Hi, my name's Hattie. So for me, I put agree because in a perfect best case scenario, yes, the state should be legislating so that everyone receives reproductive health care, the same level, the same standard of reproductive health care. But the reason that I put I didn't put strongly agree is because, well, I'm from Texas and I do not want our particular state determining how our reproductive health care is determined. And so I think that it's unfortunately something that is very political, and that, you know, healthcare choices should be able to be made in a vacuum, but that's not the way that our world works. And reproductive healthcare especially is so polarized and so politicized, and really healthcare as a whole. But those were my thoughts. And I appreciated the big laugh at me being from Texas. That was, I liked that.
Others want to share their perspective?
Especially if there's any strongly agree.
Well, to get your, more conversation started, here are some of the values tension points that might be triggered by this question. So trust or distrust of state involvement of healthcare provision, status quo versus the ideal reality, state responsibility for ensuring access to care, and state responsibility for ensuring quality of care. So in case that sparks any additional thoughts about, again, the role of the state. Because I know something that comes up for me is around funding, and what is the role of the state to ensure, that people who are receiving public insurance are able to have their full range of reproductive health care needs met, including access to contraception and abortion. Has anything come up that has changed someone's perspective or something different that they didn't necessarily think about when they first heard the statement? All right, this is Gerald again. It sounds like there's a lot of agreement about the role of the state. Okay, so here's our next one. Facility-based abortion care is the best possible care. go ahead and type this into the chat as well. Facility-based abortion care is the best type, or is the best possible care. Again, if you want to type into the chat whether you strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Okay, I think we got some, this should be an interesting discussion. We'll go ahead and open it up for folks who want to share why they agree or disagree or strongly disagree with the statement, facility-based abortion care is the best possible care. And please remember to state your name as you're speaking.
Hi, this is Kelsey again. I actually said that I agree, which I feel like is a lot different than other people. And I really wish there was a neutral option here, because I'm a very weak agree, just because I support self-managed abortions, and I support people choosing their own ways to have an abortion. If that's your cup of tea, absolutely go do that. I think I don't know enough about self-managed abortion as well. And I feel like, just in my personal opinion, I would feel more comfortable with a healthcare provider kind of overseeing my abortion, just in case anything went wrong, or in case I had any questions or needed help with anything. So again, totally support self-managed abortion, but that would just kind of be my take on it, I guess.
And I think Nicole might have said something sort of in vein as you said. This is Melissa reading a chat out loud. Nicole Lopez said, for some situations, it could be the best possible care, but not in all situations. For an early term pregnancy, manageable by pills at home, what makes a facility better? And then Abriana, this is Melissa still reading from the chat. Abriana said, I disagreed because there are different levels of comfort for different people.
And I'll go as well. I'm Elena. I guess I said disagree because I was just thinking about the time of the pandemic, and how at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of the facilities were not open and stuff. So it's we're holding that as the highest thing, and the pandemic hits, it kind of messes it all up. So I think there needs to be there's other creative ways, I guess, that we need to consider.
I'd also like to chime in. Nicole Lopez here. I was in the disagree camp. And I think it also, for one of the reasons is that it discounts midwives and people taking power into their own hands for their bodies, and kind of this offloading of medical knowledge into the realm of doctors and experts, and not allowing people to have that knowledge about their bodies. So I guess that's one other layer that I wanted to elevate.
All right, this is Gerald again. I'll share some of the what might be coming up, and some additional things for folks to think about. So here are some values and points of tension that come up for this question. So valuing medical expertise, valuing access to medical technologies, skepticism about Western medicine, appreciation for abortion providers and their efforts, understanding of where abortions might take place, self-determination and medical decision-making, and concerns about safety. Do any of those bring up additional things, or has anyone, based on the discussion so far, shifted, or was there something new that was raised that you hadn't necessarily considered that you want to share? Right. So great. It looks like we've got some agreement and some people who are shifting their answer. Sorry, Kim, we do have a few more. um,
Sorry, yeah, my mouse is going haywire. I think we should do more too.
So here is the, sorry, let me finish your thought on that. So for our organization, one of our strategic initiatives that we work on is self-managed abortion and decriminalization for people who self-manage their abortion. And this question is one where in some of the spaces, particularly when we're working with legislators and with other other advocates who don't, who may not always understand how abortion happens, and that for many folks, even if they are receiving facility-based care initially, that a lot of the aspects of for an abortion early in pregnancy, most of those are actually pills that may initially be provided by and taken in the clinic, but that the rest of it, the follow-up pills, all of that happens at home. And so in some ways, they are, patients are responsible for that aspect, and they are being, supervised in some ways and have connections to the clinics, but it doesn't require, fully being in a clinic in order to receive that care, and understanding, how safe utilizing pills, even if you're using them on your own with guidance, and so that facilities might not, a facility-based abortion may not be the best care that's available. And some of the other things that I think, people were raising are, what are, given our current environment, especially with COVID situation, with some of, folks, we've got folks who are living in very hostile states, where access to a clinic is being, limited, is being targeted, that the preference might be for a clinic-based abortion, but the reality is that might not be available, and wanting to make sure that people feel safe in the options that are available to them. And so I see a couple of another additional comment. There are some really great resources around self-managed abortion on our website. So ifwhenhow.org, and you can navigate to our self-managed abortion, and just wanting to acknowledge that for a lot of folks, even for a lot of our colleagues and coalition partners, self-managed abortion is still somewhat relatively new to them, or they have very different, somewhat outdated thinking about what self-managed abortion looks like, that it's not the coat hanger, it's not the back alley sort of abortion, that the technology has improved greatly, and that most self-managed abortions that are happening are utilizing pills. We also want to be respectful of other cultures. So there are some cultures that utilize herbs and other natural elements, and that self-managed abortion is as old as pregnancy. So for as long as people have been able to get pregnant, they've been managing their abortions as well. And thank you to Nicole for putting another great SMA resource in the chat as well. So this is definitely an issue we encourage you to learn more about. We also have a helpline the Repro Legal Helpline that is available to help assist folks who are navigating self-managed abortion. So just a little commercial for some of IFWhenHow's service. So we've got a couple more questions that will take us to the top of the hour.
Gerald?
Yeah, sure.
This is Melissa. I just wanted to add one aspect about self-managed abortion. Just in terms of, I think you touched on this earlier in terms of the pandemic, and also like post future potentially post-Roe, is making sure that people know about all their different options. And someone mentioned earlier, like earlier in pregnancy, the different types of abortion, like the abortion pill versus going in. So I think to that point earlier about just making sure this is a time that we also need to make sure that everyone knows all of their information around how to navigate.
Yes. Thank you for that, Melissa. All right. This is Cheryl again. So we are going to go to our next question, or statement, I should say. So people should only have children they are able to afford. And I'll put this into the chat. People should only have children they are able to afford. Please indicate if you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Okay, do folks want to share what is coming up for you with this one?
This is Diana Parker with Midwest Access Coalition. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, oh, hell no, because that's such a thing that people put on the Black community. Like, why are you having so many children when you can't afford, and why are you on WIC but also have a TV? Like, it's just, there's so much judgment around Black people especially, and the types of families that they want to raise, and I'm just like, absolutely not. That statement is just really, to me, it just feels so racist, in my experience in the Black community.
Other perspectives. What's coming up for you on this statement?
You know what? I'll jump in more on the agree. I'm Nick Beard, and I think where I'm coming from is I'm a little still under a year postpartum. And because I've been struggling so much postpartum, that I've really become very like, don't do it. Don't have more kids. There's so much energy in so many ways that it kind of comes from, because that's my lens I'm looking through now, that I kind of see it as, it is so much that don't do it unless you have not only financial, but a lot of emotional help and a lot of support, because it's the hardest thing I've ever done.
Hi, this is Abriana. I think I said strongly disagree because, for one, like the cost of having a child is like ever so changing. Like there's never gonna be, in my opinion, I don't think that there's like a monetary thing to put on to say like, oh, you can afford this child or you can't afford this child. And piggybacking on how this is targeted at people in the Black community, it's very much so, how do I put it? It's like a setback. It's almost like, well, what can I do? You know?
This is Cheryl again. And Nicole, I just want to uplift what you put into the chat, because this is part of this, what this exercise is designed to do, is to get people thinking about how we frame. So in Nicole's statement, I disagree with the entire premise of this framing. Why are we talking about children in the way of afford? Why are children commodities to be afforded? Why aren't we valuing capacity to love and support? those are absolutely important questions to be asking. I just want to lift up some of the other aspects. What can be coming up for folks with this question, which is a lot around self-determination in terms of deciding that one is economically unable to provide for a child, and in terms of being able to decide to carry to term irrespective of socioeconomic status. Dignity of risk, being able to decide that to carry to term even after determining that one can afford a child. And then this is, particularly in regards to wanting to address systems of an equity and inequality. What's the state responsibility to eliminate poverty? So, rejecting the framing as that the determination is based on an individual, but why are people in poverty? Why are people in positions that they may not be able to afford the children, the creation of the families that they want? What is the responsibility of the state to make sure that there are jobs that are paying living wages? That, when we think about the economic aspect and economic justice, which is a key part of reproductive justice, what are the systems? How does capitalism as a system play into people's ability to earn a living and earn a living wage, earn or work in positions where they have access to healthcare and access to the support system that they need to raise children? Because some of the expenses that may come up are things like childcare, are things like when we think about nutrition and we think about affordable housing. Those are all factors that play into somebody's ability to raise a family, that are in some ways out of their, not fully in their control. If you are living in a place that doesn't have a lot of affordable housing, or doesn't have access to public transportation that can make it easy to get to and from a job. If you are working in a system where you can work 2 or 3 jobs and still not and just barely are able to make ends meet, and are not working in situations where you have access to affordable health care, or paid leave to even make sure that when you are giving birth, that you have are able to have paid time off to do in the early part of recovery and early childcare aspects. So what is the role of the state? What are the systems that are at play that are coming into how people have access to resources, people have what they need to be to make determinations about their families, about their economic situation. So these are all good, great points to be raised. I also want to lift up what Diana has put into the chat. If we are following a people with resources, now ones should be the ones reproducing social model, it just feeds the cycle of who should exist in the world, and then those are the people who center our culture and policies and support around, and right now that's cis, white people with access and no disabilities. That's a really good point to raise. If we're thinking about who is getting access, who's being centered, who is who has had long-standing access to resources that were gained in from family generational wealth, and have access to the means to even advance through society, right? Who has access to education, and who has access to home ownership, which is a way that many families have afforded college education, being able to refinance your home. And if you are from a population that was denied access to housing, that impacts your ability to earn a living wage, to find economic security. And so again, this is how we use This is a way of using that RJ lens, that RJ squared lens, racial justice is reproductive justice, in understanding the broader context. And this is an issue, one of the strategic initiatives that we're working on is, ensuring that people have access to public benefits without stigma, without shame, and pushing back against the attempts to limit, either by by use of the Hyde Amendment in terms of limiting people's ability to get the full range of reproductive health care they need through their public insurance, or things like family welfare caps, where the state is placing limitations on who is able to access benefits based on their family size. So these are ways that we can use our values, that we can use our understanding, where some of our assumptions and biases can come into play when we are initially thinking about an issue, and taking that time to kind of pull back the layers and kind of think through, like, what are the other perspectives? What are the what's the framing that we're utilizing? How are we thinking about these issues from a systemic perspective, and not just an individual? So not putting all of the burden on an individual to access their rights, or an individual to navigate systems. What are we doing to ensure that the systems are actually set up to support, that are to be more people-centered? I love this framing, Nicole, that you put about valuing capacity to love and support, and particularly as we're thinking about family formation and when the state intervenes in a family, how are we valuing, how are we defining who is a good parent, how are we defining who should be quote unquote should be parents, and what are the ways that those folks are supported in becoming parents, and other folks are have limitations to their parenting. And a prime example for me is the situation that's happening in our immigration system, and the ICE detention centers, and the family separation policy that is splitting families apart, and the reports of sterilization without consent or knowledge that's happening, that is limiting somebody's ability to create their own family. So thank you for going through that process with us. We really think doing values clarification exercises, whether it's in small groups or whether it's in a coalition space that you're in, but when you're working in coalition with folks, having an understanding of where their alignments are, what's their level of analysis around some of these issues, and being able to think from a values perspective, we think is a key aspect of reproductive justice lawyering. All right, so we now have another break for you all. So this will be a 15-minute break, so please come back at 1/4 past. And then we will head into our final stretch.
This is Cami speaking. Can you all hear me? I'm trying to use these headphones. Okay, awesome. Thank you. I got some background noise here. Should we go ahead and get started again? We're on our final stretch. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a nice, good stretch, got some water, whatever you needed. We're on the final stretch of our presentation. I know it's been a long workshop, but I really appreciate all of your engagement and all of your attention. I especially appreciate folks sharing, your personal experiences in the last activity. It's so helpful and, illuminating to hear where you all are at, what experiences inform what you're bringing, and just appreciate you sharing that really important knowledge. So what we're going to get into for our next section, if my computer will cooperate, is thinking about lawyering in action and RJ lawyering. I think Melissa and Gerald, provided a really good framework for thinking about the lens that you can bring to this work. And I just kind of want to reiterate what Melissa said earlier, that we don't think we have the definition of RJ lawyering. This is a definition that we're trying to develop and trying to cultivate for ourselves within our work. And I think that reflects that RJ lawyering really is a practice, and it's a personal practice that I encourage all of you to develop, hopefully as a lifelong journey. So I think the question is not so much what does RJ lawyering look like, it's what does RJ lawyering look like to you and for you. And I think part of that process involves identifying your own values and refining them over time, like we just did with the values clarification exercise, especially as you reflect more on where those values come from, including your own personal experiences, your experiences of privilege or perhaps oppression. As well as learning from others as you refine those values and really leading your work with those values. I also think that it's important to think about RJ lawyering as a practice and a process. With the law, oftentimes we're really focused on outcomes, right? Did the person, did they get the outcome they were looking for when they were in court? And I think that really ignores the actual process of how people are impacted throughout these systems. And I think reproductive justice kind of tells us that the process is important, right? If a person is being represented and having legal services provided on their behalf, but they're feeling really ignored in the process, or they're having, they're experiencing discrimination in the process, that's not really a reproductive justice outcome or process. Similarly, with policy advocacy, if we pass a law, but it's not informed by the folks who it impacts, that doesn't reflect reproductive justice values. So one principle that I think is really useful, a little bit tangential, but I think it is good to help inform the idea of RJ lawyering, is something I learned while doing HIV advocacy led by people living with HIV, and that's a principle called meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, or MIPA. And so that idea is that the people who are impacted by the laws and by the regulations and by the systems are the people who should be meaningfully involved in creating those systems. So all of that is just to say, think about RJ lawyering, not so much as an outcome, but more of a process and a personal practice and set of practices. So let's talk about that a little bit more in practice. So Melissa already did share some examples of what we think RJ lawyering can look like. I think you can think about RJ lawyering regardless of where you work. A lot of people think that to be an RJ lawyer, they have to work at an RJ organization. And while that's one way to definitely practice RJ lawyering, you can practice RJ lawyering no matter what your day job is. So if you're a lawyer or an attorney, someone who's an advocate who provides direct services, you can provide direct services in a way that's informed by RJ and by the RJ squared lens. So when you're representing someone and providing direct services, are you centering their voices? Are you taking their lead? Are you thinking about when to listen up versus when to speak up as you're supporting someone in a direct service legal advocacy process? Litigation, similarly, legal advocacy is one component of the larger movements of reproductive health, rights, and justice that Gerald was setting up for us earlier. And we know that that's not the whole extent of the RJ lawyering movement. If your work doesn't focus specifically on repro and you're a litigator, you can still apply an RJ lens in how you select your plaintiffs, what arguments are you choosing to include, whose stories are you uplifting in the litigation process, and are you sticking to the status quo of how things have been done, how people are treated, or are you bringing in your own lens and your own RJ lawyering lens, regardless of the field that you work in? Also, we're seeing more examples recently of reproductive justice organizations being involved in litigation, which is really cool to see, and or contributing to amicus briefs. So if you're a litigator and you're not working directly with these groups, how can you raise that work in your own litigation? Policy advocacy, again, that principle of meaningful involvement. Who's at the table in decision-making spaces? How can you center those who are most impacted? Can you shift the way your coalitions meet so that community members can be more involved? So for example, oftentimes coalition meetings, the way policy advocacy works, they happen during the day. There's not childcare provided. They could be inaccessible. So thinking about not just what you're working on, the content of your work, but how that work is happening and are those spaces accessible? If you don't work in a repro space, can you move your organization to show up for RJ issues more and RJ squared issues? Can you use the skills that you have if you are involved in policy advocacy to train community members who are most impacted to provide their testimony and input on issues that impact them? And, if you don't do policy work in your 9 to 5, there are ways you can get involved. You can be involved in administrative advocacy, submitting public comments. You can provide your own testimony on local or state issues, and you can always elevate RJ squared issues when you are contributing to policy advocacy. We had also talked about supporting grassroots organizations. So thinking about who's in your local community, who's working on these issues. As Melissa mentioned, there's a lot of really important work happening on the ground, right? There's a lot of Black-led organizations and organizations led by folks who are most impacted by the issues, likely in your community, in your state, in your region. How can you use your skills and your platform to elevate their work? So again, as a lawyer or as a person, in a professional setting, there may be things that you can provide that maybe don't seem super interesting to you, like looking over a contract, but could be really helpful to a grassroots organization in furthering their work. So thinking about how you can use your skills, your money, your connections to further this work in ways that's helpful to the organizations on the ground in your community. I want to raise again, supporting protests, providing legal observation, providing legal support to folks who are arrested. As we know, there's still a lot to be protesting about. The outcome of the election has not changed the state of the world on a lot of issues, especially issues around racial justice and reproductive justice. So think about how you can use your legal skills, your legal credentials, your access to spaces to support the folks who are on the ground leading protests. Oh, and I see that in the chat, someone asked about what is RJ squared. Thank you for raising that. It is racial justice is reproductive justice. So RJ squared. Yeah, thank you for asking. So again, even if you don't work in reproductive justice in your 9 to 5, there are a lot of ways to plug in and get involved. Melissa's going to talk about some of the ways we provide and the community we're trying to build on that front in a few minutes. But I just want to also raise, because I feel like so many people feel like if they're not in a repro space, if they're not at a reproductive rights or reproductive justice organization, they can't contribute to this work. I just want to once again reiterate that even if you're not in those spaces, there's so much you can do to bring an RJ lens to what you're doing. So if you work for a law firm, for example, how can you redirect the resources that those very resource institutions have, right? So can your law firm cover filing fees or provide legal expertise on an issue for either an RJ organization or for a group that's working on these issues? Even things like printing, like those like maybe things that come easy in the spaces that you're in, but those can be a huge help to smaller organizations or to activists on the ground who don't have those same resources. So just thinking about ways to redirect resources, that is a way to further RJ lawyering. Even if you're not a lawyer, all of these things contribute to RJ lawyering. A few other post-election opportunities we wanted to raise. So administrative advocacy, this is something that it can feel very wonky and in the weeds of policy, but it's actually meant to be a process that the public can be involved in, regardless of your level of education, regardless of if you have a legal degree. So administrative advocacy, is how you can advocate on rules and regulations that administrative agencies are promulgating. And these often have big impacts on health, immigration, gender, LGBTQ protection. So this is an area to weigh in on, an area where If When How will be providing some additional training in the future, so keep an eye out for that. Judicial nominations, as we know, there was recently a big fight around the confirmation of our newest Supreme Court justice. That is, again, a process that people in the public can be involved in, and we have members in our community who can provide resources on that. Cabinet confirmations, we know that there's the people who are put in positions in the new administration's cabinet are going to be making big decisions that impact people's reproductive health, as well as access to other important services. So those confirmations matter too. Legislative advocacy, again, this is one of those areas where you don't have to be doing this in your job. You don't have to be an expert to learn about issues that are happening, bills that are being passed, whether at the federal, state, or regional level. And then just this note about keeping the pressure on, I think folks in this group know very clearly that the election results don't mean that our work is done. There's still so much to do. Locally, regionally, at the federal level when it comes to ensuring that reproductive justice is a reality. So just thinking about bringing all of your skills and practice and learnings to bear as we move forward. So I just want to talk a little bit more about lawyering in action. What does If When How do on that front? How are we trying to put RJ lawyering into action? One way that I'm heavily involved in is our Reproductive Justice Fellowship Program, or RJFP. This is a fellowship program for new attorneys who have recently graduated from law school. We place attorneys at organizations that are working in reproductive justice. And actually, we have a few alums on this call. Gerald, Melissa, and I were all fellows, and a couple other folks in the audience are current fellows or former fellows. And the goal of the program is twofold. One is to create entry points for new grads into the reproductive health rights and justice field, and particularly trying to change the face of lawyering. So bringing in diverse groups of folks who actually represent and look like the people who are impacted by reproductive justice issues the most. And then the goal is also to build capacity at organizations who are really leading the work on the ground in building reproductive justice. So one important thing I want to raise about our alums, we have over 80 attorneys who have gone through the fellowship program. And I think one thing that's great to note is that some of them have stayed in reproductive justice, which is awesome. They're there, they're making a huge impact, but not all of them. A lot of them have gone on to bring their RJ lens and their RJ squared analysis to other legal spaces. So we have alums who are in legal services, housing, providing folks with direct services on the ground. There are people who work in private law firms. There are people who work in foundation, helping direct where money goes in the movement. We have folks who are law professors teaching other lawyers, as well as the folks who either stayed in the reproductive justice movement or perhaps work at a reproductive rights organization, but they bring their reproductive justice lens. So that's one way that we're trying to sort of seed the movement, both grow the reproductive justice movement and get folks with reproductive justice lenses and their own personal experiences to be in other spaces where they can, bring the reproductive justice vision to life. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who's going to talk about our Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network, which is a really exciting way that you all can hopefully get more involved doing RJ lawyering.
Thank you, Cami. This is Melissa. And perfect segue discussing RJ lens in different settings, because the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network is exactly that. It's inclusive of those who are deeply steeped in this work, who are in reproductive rights, who are in social justice movements, but adjacent or intersectional, interdisciplinary with reproductive justice. But it also includes lawyers who are in the field, work in other fields, who care passionately about reproductive justice and who either want to learn more about reproductive justice or want to jump in and volunteer their legal skills into either supporting grassroots organizations or into legislative advocacy. So the RJ, and that's basically all to speak to the framework and the structure of the RJ Lawyers Network. So the RJ Lawyers Network is structured to train and mobilize legal professionals to work for reproductive justice. And the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network is built to meet people where they are. So offering introductory level training as well as advanced track for legal professionals ready to put their skills to work. So we're trying to make sure that there's a spectrum of different ways that we're supporting lawyers who care about reproductive justice to get involved in reproductive justice. So I think that also means that it's, well, I'll get into the different ways we support, but that it's a, it's not just a single component kind of network. It's not just for people to network with each other, or it's not just for them to volunteer. It's that we're also trying to make sure that everyone who's able to volunteer is volunteering with that skill set, with that knowledge base, with those tools that can make them effective at making change in reproductive justice. So the RJ Lawyers Network is a community open to those who identify as legal professionals working toward reproductive justice, who want to apply their skills to engage in reproductive justice lawyering, policy, and advocacy, and they commit to shared reproductive justice values. And so I think that that's important, that we start off with a place where, similar to exactly what Gerald did earlier with values clarification, where we discuss our values, where we understand that there's nuance and there's range, but here are the overall values that we're committed to and how we are committed to going about that. And so that's why we're trying to make sure that we are providing support when RJ lawyers come into this network. So that is the background, and now more into so what is it that folks who get involved with the RJ Lawyers Network can do? What is, what are we structuring this network in order for those who join to be able to learn and go out into the world and to start making movement towards reproductive justice? So RJ Lawyers Network members interested in and able to do pro bono work will contribute to building capacity for advocates that are already at the forefront of reproductive justice, and help advocates meet research gaps needed to prompt cultural shift necessary to ensure that everyone has the ability to decide if, when, and how to create and sustain their families. So all that is to say that we are not just working on reproductive justice issues that we care about, we are doing so with a reproductive justice lens. And that includes centering those who are most impacted by these issues. And so we want to make sure that we are lawyers, we are a part of our communities. So there's definitely space for us to advocate on behalf of our communities that we're a part of. But we also recognize that there are situations in which, like Cami said, where you listen up and you provide your skill set and you build the capacity according to what kind of research gaps or capacity gaps are needed, and play that role. So it's really important to recognize, okay, when is it that you're supporting the work of a community that needs that research gap? And when is it that you're a member of that? Are you advocating around what the healthcare system is like for someone who's pregnant, who's given birth? And if you're someone who recently gave birth and had an experience, then you're coming from a perspective where you'll be sharing your own lived experience, and that should inform the policy that you're helping develop. But there are other opportunities where lawyers will definitely need to take a back seat and figure out how they can best support the work that's already on the ground being done. I think that as lawyers, oftentimes we want to walk in and be like, we're leaders. We went into law school to learn how to like lead the charge on something, but that's not always of value. And so we're creating different trainings and different programming to support that spectrum of work that we're going to go out and be able to help support those organizations that are already doing incredible work on the ground. So through the RJ Lawyers Network, lawyers will deepen their understanding of the reproductive justice framework, and members can specifically, I guess I already talked about this one. So the next slide, kind of zoomed through that. Sorry about that. So basically here are the main aspects of what RJ lawyers, those who join the RJ Lawyers Network, will be gaining through the network. They're going to gain learning and training opportunities, mentorship and connection, and volunteer opportunities. Those are like the three main facets. But to dive a little deeper into what that means, when we say learning opportunities, that's a spectrum. We're trying to be able to be nimble and responsive to the needs of like who joins the network, where they're at, what they need. And so it includes tactical skill building workshops. So that can mean advocacy skills, gaining advocacy skills, like learning how to comment on administrative law. I know that Cami touched upon that, but that was something that for me as a fellow, I learned how to do when I walked into my fellowship, because even though I had taken an administrative law class in law school and had one of my most harrowing final exams in that class, and I think part of it was because I didn't really understand what I was learning. It wasn't until I walked into the real life setting where it was like, okay, here's the ACA. I understand the Affordable Care Act, but oh, that makes sense. Like, even though you passed one thing, all the details of how that law is implemented and state by state, it wasn't in that initial congressional, what Congress passed. And so being able to learn, and it took me, I remember the first time I wrote comments, I read the like 50-page thing we were commenting on like 3 times before I finally understood, and like wrote side notes, and then actually understood how to start writing comments on how we wanted that law to be implemented in a way that actually served the communities we were a part of. And so that's an example of the kind of skill building we want to provide. So there's legislative testimony. So Cami mentioned that can be a place. Well, learning how to write legislative testimony to be effective, it is really daunting to, sometimes you can submit it just in writing, but sometimes you might actually speak and present. And so being able to have that support about how to write your story, how to share your story or your comments in a way that makes you feel, secure and supported, and stepping into the legislative sphere and being able to help shape what laws your state legislature or legislative body is passing. So a couple, and actually Cami also touched on the judicial nominations process. So those are the types of skill building trainings we're looking at providing. We're also looking at I mentioned this sort of earlier, like how can you lawyer for reproductive justice? Education is a huge component. So there's also more conversation around, the historical context, understanding the history of reproductive oppression, because it's important to understand the context in the United States and why reproductive justice was spearheaded, and what the difference is. I think now, and in this audience is probably pretty familiar with the difference between reproductive rights, reproductive justice, reproductive health, which all have, their own merits and are important and intersect, but there are opportunities to be really clear around that and how we're making movement. Certain laws really address different components of that. So learning about intersectionality and cross movement building, understanding that the work that we do isn't in a vacuum and needs to be done in conjunction with others who are spearheading other social justice movements that are critical and important, and also that we can show up for their work because then they can show up for our work, and understanding how they connect. So those are the types of learning opportunities we're providing, or aiming and hoping to provide. And this is also a space too, if you join the network, to be able to voice something that you heard here that you're interested in learning more about, that you'd like to learn, or something that we haven't mentioned that's something that's happening in your state, and being able to provide more tailored workshops as well. We recognize that there are states facing similar restrictions that are being introduced, or similar political climates, and being able to organize and connect around those issues. So the next aspect of this is mentorship and connection. And so that's also where we push movements forward, is states are being bombarded by so many restrictions. And it's really helpful to know, I was just chatting earlier this week about how in California, when I first started voting in 2003, the anti-abortion side just kept pummeling us with specifically laws around restricting access for young people's abortion. And we rejected it all 3 times. But that's to say that then 15 years later, in the state legislature of Florida, that type of law was introduced. And so it's helpful for us to know, like, what are the tactics that the political strategies that occurred in those states, what kind of movement building did we engage in, and recognizing sometimes some of our tactics aren't as effective, and sometimes it varies in different states. So we want to be able to provide that kind of support, and that connection helps further the way that we can push back on regressive and restrictive abortion and reproductive health policies, and also ways that we can start to be creative and think proactively. So I think that we are doing that through both like classic ways of networking, and we're also providing opportunities for connection through a online forum. So when you join the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network, there's different levels of engagement that you can choose to be a part of. And so part of that is you could choose to, as part of the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network, you'll get sort of regular communication from us. So you'll learn about different volunteer opportunities. You'll learn about different learning sessions, but you can also join an online portal where you can connect with other members on your own, and you can connect with us. You can ask questions for different staff members at If, When, How. You can post different resources. We understand that a lot of times for organizations, we post our own resources on our homepage, and that makes sense. But this is a place where, you know, the resources that were put in the chat, it's a little bit more of a, we can see this chat box right now and click on it, but it's someplace where you can go back to and share broadly in this community of lawyers and those lawyering and legal professionals who are impacting the laws that shape reproductive justice. So finally, the fun part of networking is also we're making space for individuals to get to know each other. And that includes like we've done a couple of Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network events, and so far If, When, How has a spectrum of lawyers. So we've definitely been, the heart of it has been law students, and really have engineered moving forward with reproductive justice. And then we've had the fellowship for over 10 years. I think this is the 11th year, right, Cami? And so helping, like she said, bring in opportunities for lawyers to go from law school into the reproductive justice field. And now we're also trying to make sure that we are connecting and keeping in touch with those lawyers. And we've had them in the past, but this is a more concerted effort to say, like, okay, we're providing support for you all, and we're providing an opportunity and a forum for those of you who may have been a part of chapters in the past and now went on to work in tax law or to work in real estate law, to be able to stay connected to this work and to be able to keep tabs on what's happening in your community, so that you can jump in on that work or connect with a local grassroots reproductive justice organization. So the mentorship and connection and the way that we're providing support really builds into the volunteer opportunities. And I think the final kind of thing would be the type of research or type of opportunities include, you know, specifically representing some of the information I shared earlier that was representing, for example, those going through the judicial bypass process, but it also means like research. We recognize that there's a lot of on the ground work happening, but sometimes you work with different individuals where lawyers have a skill set to read really dense, like spend 3 times going through that piece of the administrative law that was released by Health and Human Services. And so, or providing legal analysis around a law that's being introduced. And that way, those who are on the ground, who are advocating, can work together to interpret that in a way that connects with individuals that are going to be impacted, that we can talk about it in everyday terms, because our reproductive health lives are concrete. It's not just abstract, it's not just politics, but we need that legal analysis to be able to make that connection. So those are the different ways that you can actually jump in. And so to conclude on the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network, this is members of the RJ Lawyers Network are challenging what it has traditionally meant to lawyers. So they're taking a people-centered approach. They're building and redistributing and sharing power and using those tools to grow and deepen capacity for grassroots and community-based partners. And so that's why we really want to emphasize that we're centering and supporting, and there may be opportunities in ways that we talk about changing the legal landscape and changing corporate law, and that's places where we might be leading the charge because we have the experience of how things have impacted us in, say, a corporate law setting. But in much of the work that we're doing, we're supporting the work that's already happening there, and we're working to shift and redistribute power in order to achieve reproductive justice. And finally, to actually join the Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network, you can go to ifwhenhow.org to our website and drop down on the About tab, and there should be a RJ Lawyers Network. Just click on that and there will be a form to sign up.
All right, so this is Gerald again. We, with this workshop, really wanted to provide some grounding. So that's why we started with our RJ Squared presentation, which again is, racial justice is reproductive justice, and rooting our conversations in values around how we're thinking about our lived experiences and identities, and talking through, what are some of the different ways that folks can get involved. This is a very short sort of start to that. Like, this is a much longer conversation that we want to engage with folks on. We hope that you will join our Reproductive Justice Lawyers Network. But we're also, we are just sort of relaunched that network over the summer. We are still in the process of figuring out what is needed. What does our community want from, what kind of resources can we help to provide? What kind of trainings would be beneficial? We have, some things that are sort of already lined up. Melissa has put together a very exciting calendar of events. We, just this week did an election recap. We have a holiday social gathering coming up, as is mentioned. We'll do some, in the new year, we'll have some additional programming. But what would be really great for us to hear from you, we wanted to build in some time at the end of our presentation, is to hear from you. Was this helpful for you? What are the pieces from this that you think you'll be able to utilize in your work moving forward? Are there other things that would be beneficial? Is there future programming that you think would be beneficial into thinking, through what support you need? Thinking about, your current position, but also thinking about where you might want to take your legal career, and thinking about other opportunities where you can, really utilize your legal training, your legal expertise, in really impacting people being able to have access to the resources and support that they need to reach reproductive justice. So we want to hear from you. what's helpful? What are you taking away from this? And what else can we, how else can we support you all? We're trying to do work too with our law student chapters as well. So thinking in particular about how do we help folks unlearn some of these dynamics that we have learned in law school, recognizing the ways that we have sort of been sort of conditioned to think a particular way about what success looks like, what, how do we do lawyering in traditional ways, what's the most important thing about, your legal training, and how do we sort of undo that in a way to really center our communities and to think about what are the needs that aren't being represented, what are the identities that haven't been uplifted, particularly as we're trying to increase diversity in law schools, increase diversity in who has access to a legal education, and then what are people doing with that legal education once they have sort of come through on the other side. So this is our the work that we are trying to do as an organization to really change the landscape of lawyering. But we can't do that on our own. We have to do that in community with you all and with your colleagues. And so, what are just, would love to hear from you all, any feedback that you have for us, and what you think you'll take away from this training, from this workshop. So feel free to either share that in person, or you can also type it into the chat if you don't want to sort of say it out loud. But we'd love, and hear any questions that you may have or any comments. And just a reminder to say your name at the start.
I have a question. This is Hattie again. I don't know if there's anyone else on this call who is in a similar situation, but I'm actually not in law school yet. And I was just wondering if any of the lawyers or current students on the call can talk a little bit more about how, I guess, how much of your passion for reproductive justice dictated you choosing to go to law school, and I guess how that worked throughout your time in law school, because I'm definitely kind of at that precipice of deciding whether or not to apply, and knowing that it is such a big financial and time commitment, want to make sure that that is the best way for me to do the work in this movement, if that makes sense as a question.
So this is Gerald. I can start. And one, we actually have a new resource that should be being published soon, if it's not already available, is a toolkit actually for people thinking about law school called Is Law School for Me? That can help answer some of those questions and help figure out if you are thinking about law school, what types of schools might be beneficial, what sorts of things to think about as you're thinking about coursework past the first year curriculum that's set for all students. But how can you utilize your a law school decision to further your wants and desires, so we can share that out with folks. I can speak from my personal perspective. I discovered If, When, How when I was in law school, and that has essentially changed the entire my entire course of my career. I did go to law school. I took off time between undergrad and law school, but I went to law school because I was interested in social justice and utilizing the law as a tool for that. And then found If, When, How, and it just it's part of my RJ origin story. And so I would encourage, if you are looking at law schools, looking at schools that do have If When How chapters, because it can help, make sure you're honing in on those opportunities. And if you are if you do decide to go to law school and you are at a law school where there's not a chapter, we can help support you to start a chapter, so that you can have these opportunities to use the resources that and access to faculty and other students and speakers and alumni, to be advancing towards reproductive justice. But I would love to hear from others. If you were involved in it with an If When How chapter when you were in law school, if you were engaged in different activities that helped you, figure out how to use your law school training, and if there are things that you learned actually from law school that are super helpful in thinking of advocacy and that sort of thing. Want to open it up for others to share their experience.
This is Cami. I'll just add, I think it's such an important question. And even though I am a person who went to law school, I will say you don't have to go to law school or be a lawyer to work on these issues. I think if it's something that you're feeling called to do and it feels like it fits with you, it feels like it fits with your goals and your skills, then certainly do it. We need more folks who have RJ values in the legal field. But one thing I discovered about going to law school is that I didn't want to be a lawyer. And I was fortunate to be able to find, policy work and If When How. And now I have a really awesome job where I don't practice law, but I get to support lawyers and law students in doing really great work. So I found a good niche that works for me. But I just want to emphasize that, it can feel like you have to go to law school to understand power and to make change, but that's not where, all of the change is happening. There's so much organization happening on the ground, and communities doing this work that aren't necessarily like ensconced in the legal framework. So just another kind of plug for, if it calls to you, yes, we need you, but if it doesn't feel like it's the right fit, it can be, a really difficult experience, like especially if you have any like marginalized identities. Law school can be really not a great experience. So don't feel like you have to do it because you want to make a change in the world.
This is Gerald again. Are there other perspectives or other questions that folks have? Then we can wrap up.
I'll just say that as a lawyer who recently graduated law school and did the If When How fellowship and now works in reproductive rights, if anybody wants to talk to me about law school, not law school, things like that, I'm available.
Thank you, Israel, for that offering. We will send out, I think we will be able to get contact information from the conference organizers. We will follow up with, the links that Cami shared earlier to the written materials. Again, if you are needing CLE, continuing legal education credits, please make sure to send an email to the email that Cami posted earlier. We'll also include that in the follow-up so that we can follow up with you with specific information that we need. And if we hope that you stay engaged with us, and again, you don't have to be like a practicing attorney or an official lawyer to join our lawyers network. Part of what we're doing is changing sort of how we're defining lawyering, and that doesn't necessarily mean you need to have gone to law school or have passed the bar and be in the courtroom in order to do this work. we think of activism as part of RJ lawyering. So, please feel free to sign up. We encourage you to sign up for the RJ Lawyers Network, and to sign up on on our listservs to stay informed of what If and How is doing, and if there are ways that we can connect with you, if ways that we can connect with your organizations, continuing to have these conversations. We're excited. We want to be in community with you all, and we are really eager to stay connected and encourage you to stay connected with us. So thank you again for joining this pre-conference. We hope you, for those who are signed up for the full conference, there's so much good stuff to come, and we hope that you to see you in other sessions. And just, thank you again for your participation and engaging with us. It's been our pleasure to be able to provide this opportunity for you all. And sending you all lots of Thanksgiving love or support as folks are taking time next week. Hopefully some of you can be with your families, but also please be safe as we navigate this global pandemic. Thanks, everyone.